The last time we started to speak on this specific slide, but I think we were getting short in time, so we didn't touch on it much. So do people, I'll read through the recommendations and then we can speak to whether or not we agree or not. So recommendations to create an equity commissioner that reports directly to Parliament. Commissioner to have an audit function. Equity commissioner to recommend special measures programs as per, I'm guessing, Article 15 of the Charter. And then act to reflect what can be done by January 1, 2040. And I know we had this side conversation about the Accessibility Act having this similar timeline. And complaints to be brought and assessed by the commissioner, as well as DM should be directly responsible for EE via their PMA. Donc, on avait eu les recommandations qu'on a discuté légèrement, mais pas tant en détail. Les gens n'ont pas eu tant de commentaires là-dessus, donc je l'explore un peu plus. Avoir un commissaire à l'équité qui se rapporterait directement au Parlement. Et ce commissaire aurait la fonction d'évaluation. Il aurait aussi la possibilité, aurait aussi la possibilité de recommander des mesures spéciales, probablement en lien avec l'article 15 de la Charte. Puis, la loi EE devrait refléter ce qui peut être fait d'ici le 1er janvier 2040. Puis, on avait mentionné que c'était le même échéancier que pour la loi canadienne d'accessibilité. Puis, on a mentionné, par exemple, les plaintes pourraient être amenées à ce commissaire pour évaluation. Et puis, les sous-ministres devraient être responsables à travers leur évaluation de rendement pour les mesures d'équité en matière d'emploi. Je ne sais pas si les gens ont des commentaires sur cette diapo. I don't know if people have thoughts or comments on this specific slide. Les gens sont en manque de café. Non, people. Oui.
Hey, there's no questions being asked right now, so if you don't mind, Lynn, just I'm coming in net new to the conversation. Is this in reaction to the key message transformative framework for employment equity, and then so this is a recommendations associated to that piece?
Okay, so I'll give background. The EE Act Task Force started the process to consult on reviewing the EE Act February 2022. It lasted for a whole lot of months. And in December 2023, so recently, they came out with the recommendations report, which is like 500 pages and a bit. So I read through this and I identified what I felt. So it's really within my lens, and I keep providing that disclaimer. So which recommendations would probably most affect us working in this space? So we went through the initial recommendations based on the various chapters, and these are the next chapters, which we had not really addressed thus far. So this is where those recommendations were taken from.
And as you're aware, are we the only venue that has spent I mean, you spent 500, went through all the 500 pages, and this is probably the only recommendation that we've seen being created up to this point?
Well, there's a whole lot of recommendations. So these were like, okay, there's some, and you will see on slide right after, there are some that apply mostly to federally regulated entities that are not necessarily public service. And there's other that apply to us. And this is where I came from with that lens. There's going to be consultations by TBS eventually through networks. They have not joined ESDC as well as the Secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor. So both entities are working on consultation guides, and as of noon, they were not approved. Donc, juste en français, je vais peut-être faire le résumé en français pour les gens. Donc, pour faire une mise en contexte, là, la loi sur l'équité en matière d'emploi fait l'objet d'une révision à travers un groupe de travail sur un task force qui avait 12 membres. Ça a commencé en février 2022. On a vu le rapport en décembre 2023. Il y a 500 quelques pages de recommandations. Donc, ça, c'est vraiment, dans le PowerPoint, c'est vraiment un résumé des recommandations qui, je pense, pourraient être pertinentes à ce qu'on fait. Puis après ça, on a eu 2 conversations jusqu'à présent sur les diapos 1 à 6, mais on a arrêté, par exemple, à 4 pour la première fois, puis la semaine où on a fait la deuxième rencontre, on a passé presque 1 heure, je pense, sur la diapo 4. Donc, c'est pour ça que je me dis, often people are just like, okay, they're not too warm, and then it comes like, oh, okay, this makes sense, or this doesn't make sense. Again, and I just spoke TBS to know what the consultations with networks would look like, but there's some measures that will be coming through in terms of official consultations. But I think we're getting ahead of the ball, ahead of the timeline, because I expect the consultation timeline to be very short if we want to get anywhere, given that it's already months late as to what it was supposed to be, and the report was months late as to when it was supposed to be released. Donc, on est peut-être 1 an là, en arrière du timeline qui avait été établi initialement. Là, on devait commencer les consultations printemps passé. Là. Donc, on est un peu loin dans l'échéancier pour quelque chose d'aussi majeur. Donc, ce que j'ai l'intention de faire, c'est vraiment d'utiliser, par exemple, les recordings pour trouver des solutions communes. So I'm trying to find the recordings that we've gathered through these conversations, and my next steps I will discuss later. But I understand there's 2 weeks for us to be able to submit that information into the actual task force. So 1 being TBS, 2 being a specific submission we could do to ESDC. But this is where the context for these conversations takes place.
Merci.
Merci. Donc, dans le thème des est-ce qu'on est pour ou contre, ou est-ce qu'on a des idées par rapport à la création d'un commissaire en équité? Do we have thoughts for or against? Unsure about the equity commissioner. Paul.
Hi, Marilyn, and thanks for providing that additional point of context. So, Paul MacArthur, I work in the Deputy Minister Champion's office. So, DM Namisniewski is the DM Champion for Federal Employees with Disabilities. Just on this particular point, it's been raised, we do have a commissioner at the Human Rights Commission that's the Chief Accessibility Officer for Canada. So it has been raised that we just want to ensure from a governance perspective that it all sort of links up and makes sense in terms of this recommendation. So those roles are clear and the differentiation is clear as well.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, juste résumer en 3 mots en français. Donc, Paul travaille avec la championne pour PWDCC. Désolée, l'acronyme en français m'échappe. Et puis, il y a juste une inquiétude ou une volonté d'aligner côté gouvernance les mandats pour s'assurer qu'il n'y a pas un dédoublement ou que les responsabilités soient bien départagées. Donc, thank you, Paul, for this. Any other thoughts, comments, or questions? Should the commissioner, oui, Leon.
Oh, hello. Let me see why my camera is not working. There you are. Yeah, no, just on the commissioner. I mean, it's just at the time that we or that's more of a throughout thread. I think highlighting accountability is one of the key elements. I know there's a lot behind the recommendations, but just in more in general terms, I know this keeps being the question or the item that keeps popping up in whatever initiatives that are applied. It's like, okay, but how is accountability going to happen, even with commissioners? So I think it's just more of a point of really driving that that comment and making the emphasis on that for I would say for most recommendations and for all those that apply.
Thank you. Donc, Leon disait que c'est toujours par rapport à l'imputabilité. Donc, on doit vraiment s'assurer que la personne sera imputable et que ça devrait faire partie, par exemple, des critères quand les gens vont postuler. Thank you, Leon. What do we think about an audit function for the commissioner? people don't have thoughts. C'est correct parce que c'est pas tout de suite. As I mentioned, like I think this serves as a great purpose in terms of having these interactions, but anything that we will gather, again, we will circulate for people to comment so they can reflect. There's going to be more time. I think this was really to get ahead of the ball. Yes, Leon?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree. I mean, as much power as a commissioner can have, to make binding recommendations or, to have that. I mean, we know that one of the main issues with the EDI right now is just that, like really enforcing again the like accountability for measures the driving. We know there seems to be a gap between OCRO and TBS, and then like how these policies go down, go or scale down for all departments, and I know that the recommendation for a commissioner comes almost from that from that point for a commissioner. I mean, we see more recommendations for commissioners. A big, my cynicism on that is like, well, we have the Human Rights Commission and we know what happens there with anti-Black racism. So also it's like, ensuring that there are like those good checks and balances, and even that these things are set up well from the beginning. But yes, there has to be I think like when we look at a lot of times when we look at some of these bodies, what they are able to do is impose a fine, and that doesn't do anything for that really doesn't do much for those who suffered from employment inequity or discrimination. That's just like yeah, it's sometimes a slap on the wrist for the organization. It's a bit of a public shaming. We sort of have that. So really is the notion of like really having a commissioner is to really clean things up and make things happen. So again, like just that really that push for that for that binding power, and even standing in that at length position, right? Which is one of the current issues that we have for not having that.
Merci.
Merci.
Merci. Donc, ça revient encore à avoir ces rôles-là qui sont clairs, qui sont non taintés, on va dire. On sait ce qui se passe justement avec, par exemple, la Commission canadienne des droits de la personne. Donc, c'est de s'assurer qu'on ne répète pas les mêmes erreurs et que quand c'est élaboré d'une bonne façon. I think Equity Commissioner to recommend special measures. I think anybody can recommend special measures based on analysis of current gaps and identified issues. Mais Max, vas-y.
Et je suis en train de me poser la question si les fonctions du commissionnaire dans tous les ministères sont très bien définies et qui sont les mêmes, ou si c'est le commissionnaire qui va lui-même décider ce qu'il va faire au niveau du département. Ceci pourrait être en fait à mesure d'avoir une fonction publique qui reflète exactement une certaine direction quant à l'imputabilité du commissionnaire. Aussi, je me demande si ce commissionnaire, par exemple, devrait être en contact avec certains réseaux en matière d'équité en emploi, et des groupes d'équité en emploi, parce que ça serait important, parce que tout ce qui serait fait serait bien regardé au niveau du département, mais aussi au niveau de ce que je peux appeler des clients en termes d'équité en emploi, qui sont ces réseaux d'équité en emploi. Donc, c'est ça, c'est cela surtout mes questions et mes concerns.
Merci. So Maximilian was saying, is the same role across the board? Would the Equity Commissioner come up with his or her own role? So there's a lot of questions. Would they be accountable or redevable in terms of the networks for which they are actually pushing for change? So all good questions for which I have zero answer, but I'm noting the questions. The EE Act with the timeline for 2040. Yeah, I don't have comments other than I'll be almost retired by then, so yay. But we'll see if it makes progress, but I'm curious how we can measure how it's going to progress over the next 16 years. Donc, je suis curieuse de voir comment est-ce qu'on pense que le tout peut être prévu ou prédit pratiquement pour le progrès au courant des 16 prochaines années. Ça fait quand même 14 ans que je fais ça et je ne sais pas que ça a tant évolué. Unfortunately, so I've been doing this for 14 years and I cannot say that it's been evolving as fast as we would like it to. Complaints to be brought to the commissioner and assessed by the commissioner. Thoughts or comments? Okay. And then DM should be directly responsible for EE via their PMA. Ooh, Shamir, bonjour.
Good afternoon, everyone. Are DMs not already responsible for EE via their PMAs?
It's an excellent question. From what I've seen, they are now accountable on some components of EE. I've seen a few PMA statements for executives as well as well, I don't see DM because I'm not that special, but I did see a few executive, and I'm guessing, as logic would have it, that the EX comes through what the DM commitments would be. So I believe it's more of a newer aspect in terms of being accountable or responsible. I personally think it comes through like policy management in terms of people policy management, where they would be accountable related to the management accountability framework as well. So there are linkages, how it used to be sold, and now there's more focus on anti-racism, diversity and inclusion after 2021, but I don't know that it's mandated or legislated. So that's why it used to be linked to people management, which relates to the MAF, which relates to the Financial Administration Act. Like there used to be a whole lot of loops to be able to make the connections between the two.
Okay. Thank you.
Make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Je vais peut-être le résumer rapidement en français. Shamir se demandait si les sous-ministres étaient responsables justement de l'équité à travers leur évaluation de rendement. Je ne suis pas aussi spéciale que d'avoir vu les évaluations de rendement des sous-ministres. Cependant, j'ai vu beaucoup d'évaluations de rendement ou les statements là, des EX, puis c'est là et la logique veut que ça vient de ce qui est en haut. Donc, théoriquement, oui. Mais ce n'est pas nécessairement un élément de la loi. Il y avait vraiment auparavant, avant le First Call to Action, il y avait vraiment des étapes comme People Management Policy, les politiques sur la gestion des personnes, qui a rapport avec le cadre de responsabilité en gestion, qui a rapport avec la loi sur l'administration des finances publiques. Donc, il y avait plusieurs étapes avant de pouvoir connecter les liens qui ramenaient à la responsabilisation sur la longévité en matière d'emploi. Mais je vais laisser Paul discuter.
Merci, Marlène. So just as it relates to measurement in general, not necessarily a solution, but a emerging theme. So as we all know, based on the Accessible Canada Act, that all departments and federally regulated agencies have to have 3-year accessibility plans and then have to report on those with a yearly progress report. So the Office of Public Service Accessibility recently did an analysis of those progress reports. And the key theme from the analysis and where there's an area for growth and learning is measurement. So how are we actually developing accountability frameworks, measurement strategies, and then leveraging that for improvement some departments are leading the way in that. Others have a lot more work to do, but it was a really important theme that came out of that analysis.
Merci. Donc, Paul a mentionné qu'il y a eu justement une évaluation des plans d'accessibilité. Parce que selon la loi canadienne d'accessibilité, il y a des exigences pour les 3 ans. Et puis, ces plans-là ont été évalués et il y a vraiment un thème commun qui revient, soit la mesure de la performance ainsi que les cadres de performance qui semblent être un enjeu actuel. Donc, on espère que les gens vont travailler fort là-dessus au cours des années à venir. Puis, ça pourrait inspirer justement les mesures concrètes des plans d'équité. Parce que on en a jasé avant, là, there's, and I'm completely responsible for this as well. Having worked in 14 years in equity, it's a whole lot of laundry lists of what you're going to do, but not a whole lot of measurements of what those initiatives do in terms of concrete change. So I'm just as guilty as anybody in terms of having lacked that measurement in my own activities in the past. But I think it's one way for us to measure if we're dismantling the systemic issues. Donc, on verra si les mesures nous forcent vraiment à démanteler les enjeux systémiques parce que c'est sûr qu'en mesurant, tu vois si oui ou non, tu étais à la bonne place. Donc, merci pour ça. Thank you for that. And then we'll go to the other recommendations. And this is why I was speaking to some recommendations. I'll just put it in the chat. Je vais juste les mettre dans le clavardage. Donc, il y a juste 2 recommandations qui, selon moi, pouvaient ou non s'approprier un peu notre temps, là. Maybe that's me coming from PSPC at this point. So within the scope of how we are measuring, is it working? Yes, okay. So the public service should report on permanent residents working in Canada and abroad. So it's not just and I think we've gained some some, how would we say, some ground. To be honest, this is one of the breakthrough I feel in 2021 when the Public Service Employment Act was amended to include permanent residents. Donc, je pense que c'est un des éléments qui a progressé au courant des dernières années par rapport au changement de la loi sur l'emploi dans la fonction publique, où maintenant les postes sont ouverts aux résidents permanents. Donc, il n'y a plus juste la priorité pour les Canadiens, les citoyens canadiens. Donc, est-ce que de les inclure, les résidents permanents, permanent residents, within the scope of the EE Act initiatives makes sense? I will let you tell me if it does or not for you. Maybe. Okay, we'll keep this as maybe. Okay.
May I interject here?
Sorry?
Oh, it's Hayat.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Ça va bien?
Oui, ça va, merci. Donc, je pense qu'ils devront être inclus. I think they must be included because what happened, it's maybe for the 1 or 2 years. After that, they will turn up a full Canadian citizen. So why should we exclude them?
Merci.
Thank you.
Merci. Donc, merci pour ce commentaire. Ensuite, il y a un autre élément là, que je trouvais pertinent within the scope of items in 7. So procurement contracts for equity groups, social procurement policies towards sustaining and substantive equality. So capturing information as to who gets awarded contracts, basically. Okay, we'll let it simmer. Oui, Tarek. You're on mute, dear.
Je m'excuse. I'm having a difficult time trying to understand how the equity groups get into this procurement contract vehicle, because my understanding is if we're talking about groups that are essentially new to how the procurement contracts work to begin with, that awareness is completely lacking from what I can recall for anyone that I've tried to mentor through this this type of initiative. So does this also then look at what awareness we're going to be able to provide in order to make sure that everyone knows that it exists?
Okay, so, and I'm not part of, I have the PSPC hat on, but I'm not part of those two teams that are working. So there's procurement assistance branch. I hope I make the colleagues proud here. There's a procurement assistance branch which goes out to communities and explains how to apply to specific bidding process. So I know there's people doing that. There's like career fairs or whatnot. There's actual sessions that take place. I want to give them kudos because really they do try really hard, that team. So il y a une équipe à SPAC qui fait vraiment du outreach avec les communautés. Ils font du rayonnement ou ils vont directement dans les communautés. Par exemple, Catherine, dans notre équipe, qui n'est pas là aujourd'hui, est à LA, la chanceuse, mais a fait, par exemple, une session en Ontario. Là, ils ont fait une session avec la communauté sourde. So they did do a session with the deaf community there. So then she was able to explain the procurement aspect there. Donc, je sais que ça lieu. Like, I know this aspect of things is happening. I also know that we have a great group that's working on diversifying suppliers. Donc, and also they are looking at the accessibility components. So there's a few items within PSPC, and there's that team that works on making sure that any bids coming in has an accessibility component. Donc, il y a cette équipe-là qui travaille sur toutes les soumissions qui ont une composante doivent avoir cette composante-là d'accessibilité. Puis, il y a une autre équipe qui commence à avoir les données. So, akin to self-identification for our employees, there's this other project team that is working on gathering information on who has access or who are the bidders in terms of akin to self-ID, but it's not related to the EE Act, so I don't know what to call it yet, but that type of information is starting to get captured. So there's those three teams, I want to say, that have a hand in the process related to this specific item. Does that somewhat answer?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Donc, il y a 3 équipes, and it might be interesting in the future to see how they all work on that, because I personally believe they do a whole lot of work and it's directly with communities. Donc, ces équipes-là, je pense qu'ils sont bien positionnés pour aiguiller comment les services ou les relations avec les clients peuvent être importantes et intéressantes dans le contexte. Et merci. Puis après ça, on va y aller sur les recommandations générales. So they did do overall recommendations that people should look at. Donc, within the scope of overall recommendations. So they did all the recommendations, like individual recommendations, then within the scope of the end of the document, there's also overall recommendations. So harmonizing legislative framework. For some of us very old people in this space, we used to have the EE Act. Sometimes we would advise on the Public Service Employment Act, say what is duty to accommodate in the process, or how can you look at EE groups within the scope of hires. But really now it's Canadian Human Rights Act, Accessible Canada Act, there's so many different types of legislation that have popped up through the years or that are interconnected. Multiculturalism Act, il y a beaucoup de lois qui étaient indépendantes mais se sont jointes ou ont été créées ou se sont greffées à ce qu'on fait. Donc, il y a, par exemple, best example, It would be in terms of definitions for self-identification of persons with disabilities. So there is one definition that goes currently with the EE Act. However, it's not aligned because it's older. Then the Accessible Canada Act definition. So there's some inconsistencies. This is also why we see discrepancy in terms of representation versus expected representation. The census data uses the Accessible Canada Act definition in terms of crafting the LMAs, whereas within the scope of the core public service, we're still using the old definition of the EE Act. Donc, il y a cet enjeu-là qui semble être plutôt majeur. Mais ce n'est qu'un exemple parmi tant d'autres, ne serait-ce que les définitions utilisées par une loi ou par l'autre. Donc, ça, c'est la première recommandation globale. And then making the EA quasi-constitutional, donc mettre ou rendre la loi de dictat en matière d'emploi quasi-constitutionnelle. So I don't know if people have thoughts or questions or comments about these two items. Do I have some of my justice friends, lawyers on the line that could help define what would be implications of a quasi-constitutional act? I don't see. Maybe next time. So basically, and I'm no lawyer, it would make it a whole lot heavy in terms of obligations and meeting requirements, because at this point, whenever we're trying to challenge something, the Constitution, and one example would be the OL. Donc, la loi, par exemple, sur les langues officielles est une loi qui est quasi constitutionnelle. Donc, c'est quasi, presque impossible de pas l'empêcher, mais de la modifier ou de l'éviter, si je peux dire. So one of the examples of the quasi-constitutional legislation is the OL Act. So however you're trying to play with it or not avoid it, but l'esquiver, you cannot, because it's one of those legislation, the charter as well. So this is why it would give more teeth to the EE Act. But again, I'm not a lawyer. I can just say what I know, which is a little bit, I don't know much. Donc, ça serait ça qui serait l'impact, par exemple, de la mettre quasi constitutionnelle. Est-ce que les gens ont des commentaires ou des questions? We're good. And again, like all of these, oh, Leon, go ahead.
Just a quick, in the interest of just saying, yes, it makes sense. I mean, definitely harmonizing. Yeah, we know when we deal with sometimes pulling these different elements from as you well said, the Multiculturalism Act or the ACA, the Accessibility Act, or here and there, and you're like, see, it says here that you should be doing this, and it's almost like my question is also, why should we be pulling from three different acts, and on top of that, when you're saying the quasi-constitutional, I mean, it's almost like it's already constitutional, because on the one side is like, discrimination is a constitutional issue on the charter. However, at the same time, we see how there is a big gap between between, let's say, even the charter, the application of that, and so on, so on. So I can see I wish I had more knowledge as to what happens after, when you say, okay, it's more about I see that part as to what happens when that is broken, because something, when that is broken or respected, that's generally more on a constitutional basis. I mean, don't want to necessarily say human rights, but it kind of means that you can actually go to the Supreme Court, all the way to the Supreme Court. That's a basic element, right? But no, it doesn't feel right now that anybody would pursue the EEA all the way to the Supreme Court, no, and that would be quite convoluted. And again, I'm not even though I worked in a tribunal, I don't have that legal knowledge whatsoever. But I think there is an aspect of that, because a lot of times the issue is even what is not law becomes law as set up by the courts, and this is one of the, I think, I mean, I wish I had more knowledge, or someone had that knowledge of what is lacking, or what has been decided by tribunals. This is something that a lot of times, how have they ruled in these situations? Because for certain laws or certain acts, once like courts or whomever is the adjudicator sort of follows that. So that in itself becomes established. So whenever there's some room for interpretation, some ambiguity, then in that case this could be a court saying, actually disability means this, as per the ACA. So even if it's not necessarily in the act, that would be almost like an amendment to the act, like a de facto amendment to the act. So I can see the argument for that. I wish we had that legal expert opinion to put a little bit of humph into what is driving that, but I can see a big argument for that, because right now it's part of the act not having much teeth.
Merci. Donc, Léon parlait justement que ce que ça permet d'avoir une loi quasi-constitutionnelle, c'est de pouvoir amener une plainte, par exemple, à la Cour suprême, ce qui cause souvent de la jurisprudence et qui permet de faire des ajouts, des modifications aux lois existentielles. Donc, il y a certaines valeur ou une certaine démarche qui serait ajoutée, dans le fond, là, pour aller contester quand les droits sont brimés. Si la loi devenait quasi-constitutionnelle, au lieu, je présume, que d'avoir des plaintes individuelles, par exemple, à la Commission canadienne des droits de la personne. Donc, ça pourrait être intéressant. Mais la prochaine fois, je vais demander aux amis de justice qui pourraient nous expliquer ça serait quoi les implications. So next time, I'll try to get some friends from justice who could explain what this change could mean in terms of legal aspects. So thank you for that. And that covers pretty much all of the recommendations in terms of next steps. As I mentioned earlier, the consultation guides by ESDC and TBS have not been finalized as of noon today. So I think we're ahead of the game. Donc, l'heure de midi, les guides de consultation n'avaient pas été encore finalisés par le secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor et ESDC. Donc, ce que je pense qu'on pourrait faire, c'est quand même utiliser les 3 enregistrements pour débroussailler un peu les thèmes, pour avoir des recommandations formelles à inclure dans les guides de consultation. So within the scope of these conversations, I think we could identify what recommendations and considerations we've discussed. So when the documents one day come through, we can put them in and make some sort of sense, which we would, again, hopefully discuss, maybe with some great folks from justice or some of the leads on these specific files. Again, might be bringing in some of the PSPC people working on I call it social procurement aspects of things. So that's happening hopefully in the next few weeks. And then there's 2 ways to submit the input, would be through TBS, and there's also to do an independent submission directly to ESDC. I think both routes are plausible, and it's the route we took in 2022 when we submitted. It needs basically recommendations for the EE Act changes. Donc, il y a différentes façons là, de soumettre l'information. On peut aller soumettre le secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor nos recommandations ou nos pensées, ou on peut le faire indépendamment aussi à ISDC. La dernière fois, en 2022, on avait fait les 2 routes, là, on l'avait soumis d'un côté et de l'autre. Donc, je pense qu'il y a une valeur quand même d'utiliser cette approche-là. Parce que d'une certaine façon, ça ne sera pas nécessairement dilué avec les autres soumissions qui pourraient aller au secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor, mais je n'ai pas de nouvelles sur leur approche non plus. Donc, merci. Roger, are you online? And I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yay.
Yes, I am.
He's like, oh no, Marilyn, what the? Do you have 2 seconds maybe to speak as to what we're planning for Tuesday?
Yeah, certainly. Happy to.
Merci.
I think, Madeline, you have put out a placeholder invite to this community of practice. And I've just received the Zoom link about an hour ago. So we'll put something together probably tomorrow to send out the Zoom link. So this is a special, I guess, plug for Tuesday's conversation with Jennifer Llewellyn. She's an international expert on restorative ideology, restorative engagement, and we're going to be quite privileged to have her spend an hour and a half with our community of practice. Basically, it's a beginning conversation for some of us. For others who might be well on their way to understanding restorative engagement, it'll be an opportunity to reaffirm your understanding and I guess your commitment to the idea of being more restorative with one another. So we have invited Jennifer in some ways to get ahead of what might be coming from Treasury Board on the restorative front. So anyway, please make time in your calendars to join this very important conversation. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, on va avoir la conversation mardi là, sur les principes d'engagement. On va dire très particulier. Roger et Marie-Michel à PPSI ont quand même été chercher des services d'interprétation aussi parce qu'on veut s'assurer que tout le monde peut participer dans leur pleine capacité à cette conversation. Jennifer est vraiment une experte. J'ai été fascinée quand on a eu l'échange avec elle. C'était fabuleux de l'écouter. Donc, j'ai bien hâte à mardi. Hoping you can join us. Hoping you can invite people that are working in values and ethics, in employment assistance programs, all of these people that are beautiful humans who have a role that might not be working on employment equity, but they do have a role in terms of what we're trying to achieve overall, all of us together. Donc, ça va être très intéressant comme conversation. I see a question. Roger, will it be recorded? Do we know if there's capacity to record?
That's a good question. I'll check with Jennifer to see how she feels about that as the lead facilitator. But we'll figure that out. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you. So thanks everyone. It was a pleasure as always, and hopefully we see you next week. Donc, merci d'avoir été présent et pour vos échanges comme d'habitude, c'est super apprécié. Puis ce n'est que le début. We're just really ahead of our of their time, not ahead of our time because we're a year late, as I keep saying. Donc pour moi, on est sur la balle, on n'est pas en retard et c'est ça qui est important pour moi. Mais merci à tout le monde d'être là et pour vos échanges and hoping to see you next week et à la semaine prochaine. Prenez soin de vous. Take good care.
Bye, toi aussi.
Bye Patricia.
Bye bye.
Bye Leon. Bye Roger. Take good care.